us pray. God, we thank you for bringing us here together this morning, for the opportunity to preach the good news among friends. Speak your truth through my words, that they may be vessels for your marvelous light. Amen. A few years ago, a friend and I were finishing up our final years of college and university at the same time. It had been a long and demanding stretch of schooling, and we decided that we should both mark this turning point in our lives by treating ourselves to something special, something we would not normally buy. We decided that we would each buy a bottle of really fine cologne. So a couple of $100 later, my friend and I were sitting in my parents' living room and comparing our purchases. Eagerly, I tested out a bit of his cologne, Penhaligon's English Fern. Special appointment to the Prince of Wales. Just a drop or two, he said, that was all you needed. So I carefully put a couple of drops on my wrist, no more, rubbed it onto my neck, sat back, and enjoyed the beautiful scent, which the Penhaligon's website describes like this: a gorgeous, fresh, and earthy fragrance that is both elegant and sensual, with head notes of geranium and lavender, heart notes of clover, base notes of patchouli, sandalwood, and oak moss. We sat back and basked in our own classiness. Just then, the back door opened and in came my father. Before he had so much as closed the door behind him, he took one whiff of the air and exclaimed, "Why does it smell like old men in here?" A couple of drops was all it took to fill the house. I think of that every time I read the story of the anointing of Jesus. The text says, "The house was filled with the fragrance of the ointment." And Mary had a full pound of the precious oil. In the parallel story in the Gospel of Mark, the unnamed woman actually breaks the jar of oil and pours out every drop onto Jesus. Now, John doesn't go so far. He doesn't tell us how much nard Mary used, but based on how upset Judas was, we can be sure that it was more than a few drops on the wrist. There can be no doubt about it. Mary is wasteful. The average worker's wage in Jesus' time was 1 denarius per day. This ointment was worth 300. That's close to a full year's wages. Yet Mary pours it over Jesus' feet, tired, sweaty feet, which would only get filthy again the next morning. So when the heady scent of the perfume fills the house, Judas doesn't smell its beauty. He smells billows of money wafting away, money which could have been put to 100 better uses. Why was it not sold and the money given to the poor? But it gets worse. It isn't just the amount of oil that's wasteful. It's Mary's whole attitude. She's down on the floor at Jesus' feet, her hair hanging down, something that would have been only appropriate for a bride or a harlot. She rubs the oil in with her hands and wipes it with her hair. It's a posture of the utmost intimacy, love, and submission. It isn't just her wealth that is poured out at Jesus' feet, it's her dignity too. We can't blame Judas for being uncomfortable. It seems too intimate, an emotional wastefulness that seems almost indecent to behold. Now, the gospel writer is quick to condemn Judas. In fact, he does exactly what Professor Wilson has warned us against. We've been told, don't psychologize the characters. Describe what they do, but don't get inside their heads and try to explain their motives. Well, Judas was long dead by the time the Gospel of John was written, so it's a classic case of psychologizing. Perhaps he was a thief, perhaps not. In any case, his objection makes perfect sense. Why should Mary be so prodigal? And we in the church are wasteful like Mary. It's one of the oldest and most pernicious criticisms of the church that we often spend more money and effort on preserving and beautifying our buildings and our liturgy than on serving the needy. In every generation, the charge of hypocrisy hits us hard. It's a pernicious charge because it's at least partly true. One of the most popular Christian pilgrimage sites in Europe is the monastery of Jasna Góra in the city of Częstochowa in Poland. It houses many of the country's religious treasures, including the famous painting of the Black Madonna, which is said to have been involved in many miracles. Inside the monastery, it is dazzling. Ornate carvings and lavish colors strike the eye, and there's gold at every turn. Gold paint, gold statues, gold chalices and monstrances. Every year, millions of pilgrims come to pray there and to experience the extravagant beauty of the place. Many pilgrims choose to walk there, and lots of devout homeowners are happy to give the pilgrims a bed for little or no fee. In some ways, it's the ideal form of Christian hospitality, but some of the locals disagree. They see how many pilgrims scurry past the grim industrial face of the city in their haste to get to the monastery, how they clog the city's transit, and how because of the hospitality of those who give free accommodations, the pilgrims end up spending little money to support the local economy. Money is poured into the coffers of the church, while the community outside gets shortchanged. It's extravagance, pure and simple, and it's not confined to Polish Catholics. Our architecture, our symbols, our vestments, and our music, sometimes it all seems a little too much. Is it not the same Jesus that Mary anointed, who also said, "Sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor"? How do we reconcile those two sides of Jesus? We like to think of Jesus as the great whistleblower against hypocrisy, but was he himself a hypocrite? Sure, we can say that our liturgy is an offering to God, but that can never erase the question that has been echoing down church walls since the time of Judas. Why was this not sold and the money given to the poor? Maybe God doesn't want extravagant gifts. Maybe God doesn't want beautiful organ music and silver chalices. And we in this room now, on the road to being preachers, do we really need to lay down our whole careers at Jesus' feet? We could have been doctors, lawyers, actors, musicians. Will God thank us for taking our talents and throwing them away on the unlikely dream of a dying church? We are as wasteful with ourselves as Mary was. Was it necessary? 2 drops of perfume on the wrist, rubbed around the neck. That would have been enough to fill the house. But Jesus treasures Mary's gift. He treasures it more dearly than she could ever have expected. In the version of the anointing from the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says, "She has done a beautiful thing for me. Wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." And it has been. Now, we read the story from the Gospel of John, and if John was reading Mark, he chose not to include that verse. He didn't need to. John shows us exactly how much Jesus treasured Mary's gift. We see it in the very next chapter of the Gospel. The setting is the upper room, and the Passover is finally at hand. Jesus rises from the table, takes off his clothes, and wraps himself with a simple linen towel. He pours water into a basin, and before the disciples know what's happening, he's down at their feet like Mary was, washing them and wiping them with the only garment he's wearing. That's how much Jesus values Mary's gift. He values it so much that he imitates it. Mary knelt before him in a posture of total self-offering. She laid down at Jesus' feet all her status, all her worldly dignity. When Jesus washes his disciples' feet, he exalts her offering. It actually becomes a command. He says, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." This is the climax of John's Gospel, when the Son of God kneels down and wipes his friend's feet. Jesus loved this strange family from Bethany, and we can see why. They're a sort of microcosm, a little picture of what happens when God's love lives in human hearts. When Jesus said, "Abide in me as I abide in you," he may well have pointed to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Each member of the family foreshadows something about Jesus. They share in his story. Mary anoints Jesus' feet, just like Jesus washes the disciples' feet a few days later. And Lazarus, raised from the dead, foreshadows Jesus' own resurrection. As for Martha, the text simply says, Martha served. She prepares a meal for Jesus, that's all. But Jesus will glorify even this simple act of service. Remember the very last scene of John's Gospel by the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are fishing on a chilly morning, the wind is blowing, and the risen Jesus appears on the shore. And Jesus, just like Martha, serves. He serves them a breakfast, bread and fish cooked over a charcoal fire, the first feast of the Messianic kingdom. Nothing is given in vain. Jesus treasures every gift. He takes everything they offer him and it becomes part of his glory which is God's story of costly prodigal love. Jesus breathes sacramental meaning into whatever is laid before him. He glorifies it and exalts it, and the fragrance fills the whole house of God. God treasures all our gifts. For many of us in this room, this does mean our whole careers as we seek to become pastors, theologians, or teachers. But every day of the ministry, God will cherish, glorify, and exalt, just as Jesus cherished every drop of ointment that fell on the floor. A friend once came to me with some trepidation, and she confided in me that she was thinking of becoming an Anglican nun. This was a bit of a shock. Here was a young woman with lots of worldly opportunities, someone who I know had been looking forward to getting married someday, having her own house and family. So I was taken aback. What makes a person want to make the vows of the convent? Poverty, chastity, and obedience. Had she had some sort of visionary experience? I wondered a little skeptically. So I asked, what made you think of doing that? And she explained by quoting a hymn. She said that she couldn't stop thinking about the last verse of the hymn, "My Song is Love Unknown." It's a beautiful hymn, a poem from the 17th century set to a heartbreaking tune. It's a poem for Good Friday. The poet goes through the Passion story and asks how he could ever deserve the love that Jesus gave. The last verse goes like this. Here might I stay and sing, no story so divine. Never was love, never, dear King, was grief like thine. This is my friend, in whose sweet praise I all my days could gladly spend. That verse was her reason, and I've never heard a call story that made more sense. Some people, she explains, just need to stay and sing, to stop in the middle of the busy sidewalk and shout out what God has done. We really could spend all our days in his sweet praise and spend them gladly. Of course it's wasteful. To dedicate our lives to God is extravagant. It's foolish. It makes no more sense than to pour out a bottle of nard on a man's feet. But what we call foolishness is God's Spirit overflowing within us, because God's own story is nothing less than divine foolishness. God meets us as we make our sacrifice, whatever it might be, and treasures it. God takes us out of the economy of this world, the economy that counts coins. God takes us into the divine economy, which is the economy of self-emptying love. God's love is costly and wasteful to the point of death on a cross. But can love that is not wasteful really be love? God has given each of us a treasure that we hold in earthen vessels, like a jar of precious ointment. Mary laid her treasure at Jesus' feet, and we might, by the grace of God, do the same. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also.